Good afternoon. The 7,559th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. At the outset of this meeting, I should like, on behalf of the members of the Security Council, to express our profound sadness and deep outrage at the horrendous terrorist attacks that took place in Paris on the evening of the 13th of November. These attacks led to the loss of so many precious lives and a huge number of casualties. To the families of the victims, both French and from 19 other countries at this point, and to the people and the government of France, the Security Council expresses its heartfelt sympathy and condolences. These and other recent attacks, including the terrorist attacks in Beirut, Lebanon, on the 12th of November, have affected countries and people from all over the world. The members of the Security Council offer their sympathy and condolences to all of the countries affected. I now invite you to rise and observe a minute of silence in tribute to the memory of the victims. Thank you. The provisional agenda for this meeting is International Tribunal for the Prosecution of Persons Responsible for Serious Violations of International Humanitarian Law committed in the territory of the former Yugoslavia since 1991. International Criminal Tribunal for the Prosecution of Persons Responsible for Genocide and Other Serious Violations of International Humanitarian Law, committed in the territory of Rwanda and Rwandan citizens responsible for the genocide and other such violations committed in the territory of neighbouring states between the 1st of January 1994 and the 31st of December 1994. The agenda is adopted. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. The Council has before it the text of a statement by the President on behalf of the Council on the subject of today's meeting. I thank the Council members for their valuable contributions to this statement. In accordance with the understanding reached among the members of the Council, I shall take it that the members of the Security Council agree to the statement, which will be issued as a document of the Security Council under the symbol S/PRST/2015/21. It is so decided. The meeting is adjourned. The 7,560th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Stephen O'Brien, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Ms. Zainab Hawa Bangura, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. And Ms. LEILA ZERROUGUI, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2015/862, the report of the Secretary General on the implementation of Security Council resolutions 2139, 2014, 2165, 2014, and 2191, 2014. I now give the floor to Mr. Stephen O'Brien.
Madam President, thank you very much. I would like to begin my intervention by expressing my deepest condolences to those affected by the recent ISIL attacks in France and Lebanon. The Syria crisis is a chronicle of missed opportunities by the Security Council, member states with influence on the parties, and the broader international community to bring the conflict to an end. More than 5 years since the unrest in Syria began, parties to the conflict continue to commit unthinkable atrocities on a daily basis, plunging Syria and its citizens deeper into darkness. I very much welcome the recent international talks in Vienna. This momentum must be seized to leave no stone unturned to put an end to this horrendous war that has cost an estimated 250,000 people their lives, given rise to extremist and terrorist groups, and reduced much of the country, a middle-income country, to rubble. The fighting has also propelled the world's largest humanitarian crisis of the 21st century, with some 13.5 million people in Syria in need of some form of humanitarian assistance, including 6 million children, and driven over 4 million people to seek safe refuge outside their home country. The neighbouring countries are shouldering most of the burden with remarkable generosity and sacrifice. Yet many Syrians who have lost hope and are fleeing unspeakable violence and whose resources are all but depleted are willing to risk their life in perilous journeys across the Mediterranean. Some 400,000 people, that's over 50% of the arrivals by sea in 2015, are Syrian. And still they flee. Yesterday, today, and without a political settlement, tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Each day, even as winter approaches, and I sadly predict all the way through it. So, Madam President, the Security Council members and the international community must also redouble their efforts to oblige the parties to comply, finally, with the demands made by this Council in resolutions 2139, 2165 and 2191. As we have sat at this Council chamber month after month, we have borne witness to all parties to the conflict failing to protect civilians. Each month, I speak of what seems like never-ending violence, killing innocent civilians, including children. The indiscriminate use of weapons continues unabated in the Syria conflict. In October, hundreds of civilians were killed or injured in direct or indiscriminate attacks by all parties, due to the continued use of explosive weapons in populated areas, including through barrel bombs and other aerial weapons, shelling and car bombs. On the 30th of October, several airstrikes hit the Al-Hal market in Douma, rural Damascus, killing at least 60 civilians and injuring 200 more. The day before, airstrikes reportedly hit the main field hospital in Douma, killing at least 15 civilians and injuring 50 others. Following these attacks, Jaish al-Islam reportedly used dozens of prisoners as human shields, placed in cages around heavily populated areas to seek to deter further airstrikes in civilian areas. Elsewhere, just a few days ago, on the 10th of November, more than 23 people were killed and 40 injured when non-state armed opposition groups caused 2 explosions in Latakia city. Meanwhile, ISIL and other terrorist and extremist groups continue to cause carnage across the country. For example, in Aleppo Governorate, ISIL detonated a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, a VBIED, in Khretan, killing more than 20 people in early October. Such indiscriminate attacks are not only a tragedy which kill and injure innocent people, they may amount to war crimes. And the perpetrators must be aware that they will, one day, be held accountable for their actions. The pace of displacement in Syria remains relentless. In Aleppo, at least 50,000 people are confirmed to have been displaced since early October, following an escalation of fighting between non-state armed opposition groups and the government of Syria. This number could be as high as 100,000. ISIL attacks on Mahin and Hawarin in eastern rural Homs in late October has led to the displacement of an estimated 25,000 people. Further displacement is expected to continue at a similar rate unless there is a reduction in the violence. Madam President, the attacks on civilian infrastructure also continue unabated, including relentless attacks against healthcare facilities and personnel across the country. According to the Physicians for Human Rights, in October there were 16 attacks on medical facilities, the highest in a single month since the conflict began, and 7 medical staff were killed. Parties to the conflict must ensure respect for and protection of health facilities, personnel, and patients under international humanitarian law. Meanwhile, medicines and medical supplies continue to be prevented from reaching those who desperately need them. The overall impact on the health situation has been devastating, with many civilians, particularly in areas not controlled by the government, unable to access even the most basic medical care, and the routine immunization coverage in Syria has dropped from 95% in 2010 to 64% in 2015, and in some places is as low as 20%. This poses an acute risk for deadly epidemic disease in many areas. Surely, meeting the health needs of children who represent our future should be considered as a lowest common denominator of our humanity. So, Madam President, we need a firm commitment from the parties to the conflict to take all necessary measures to protect civilians and to stop the targeting of civilian infrastructure, including medical facilities, schools, and key infrastructure networks. And, Madam President, in spite of repeated calls by this Council, humanitarian actors continue to be prevented from gaining sustained, unhindered access to millions of people in need. While active conflict and insecurity are a limiting factor, the parties continue to delay or obstruct assistance to people in need. We have only been able to reach a small proportion of the 4.5 million people in need in hard-to-reach areas in 2015. Nearly half of those in need in hard-to-reach areas, some 2.2 million, are living under terror and subjugation in ISIL-controlled areas, to which the United Nations and our partners continue to have virtually no access. We must spare no effort to ensure these people receive the assistance they desperately need. The parties to the conflict, largely by ISIL and the government of Syria, continue to use siege as a war tactic, with an estimated 393,700 people living under siege. This includes some 200,000 people in Deir ez-Zor city by ISIL, some 181,200 people by the Syrian government in various locations in eastern Qatar, as well as Daraya and Zabadani in rural Damascus, and some 12,500 people by non-state armed opposition groups and the Nusra Front in Foa and Kafraya in Idlib. These people have next to no access to the basic essentials of life, and our ability to reach them is extremely limited. So far in 2015, the United Nations has only been able to reach 3.5% of the people with health assistance and only 0.7% of people with food per month in besieged areas. Such an inhumane tactic of war is unlawful and it must end immediately. Madam President, as I have said to this Council before, we need to make urgent progress to reach people in hard-to-reach and besieged areas, as living conditions in these areas continue to deteriorate and the onset of winter is not far away. So far this year, only 30% of the convoy requests made by the United Nations have been approved in principle by the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and less than half of those approved have been able to actually proceed due to a combination of lack of final security clearances from Syrian authorities, lack of safe passage from non-state armed opposition groups, and insecurity. And I call upon the Syrian authorities to urgently approve the 46 currently pending interagency convoy requests and allow convoys previously agreed in principle which are awaiting their clearance to proceed. I also call on non-state armed opposition groups as well as listed terrorist groups to allow the deliveries they are preventing. Over 1.4 million people in hard-to-reach and besieged locations would be assisted if these convoys were able to proceed. The planned humanitarian airlift to Deir ez-Zor, although approved, has been unable to proceed due to the deteriorating security situation around the airport. And Madam President, despite all the challenges, the United Nations and partners continue to reach millions of people in need through all modalities. In the past month alone, the United Nations and its partners delivered food aid to over 4 million people, water, sanitation and hygiene support to over 3.5 million, and medicines and supplies for 717,000 treatments. The commitment and bravery of the thousands of aid workers who deliver much-needed aid at great personal risk are deeply humbling, particularly Syrian organizations, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, and volunteers, who are often the first responders on these front lines. I once again stress the need for the United Nations to be able to use all modalities, across conflict lines and across borders, in order to reach people in need in Syria, wherever they may be found. Resolutions 2165 and 2191 have made a difference by enabling the United Nations and partners to reach some people in need who were largely inaccessible before. Through cross-border deliveries, the United Nations and partners have been able to regularly reach millions of people. This complements the crucial work of international non-government actors who continue to provide large-scale assistance across the country. We remain committed to reaching all those in need, and we need any and every route possible to do this. Madam President, the status quo simply cannot continue in Syria. We have seen the devastating consequences of failing to act. This failure has eroded confidence in the international community. The people of Syria deserve more than the discussions we are having or the aid we are providing. They deserve an end to this senseless violence. The recent international talks in Vienna provide a glimmer of light that international diplomacy can provide a solution to the conflict. We must take advantage of this rare moment of diplomatic opportunity to push for a negotiated political solution and create the conditions for a nationwide ceasefire. At the same time, this new diplomatic momentum should be used to generate early dividends for the Syrian people. Most immediately, I urge the Council and relevant Member States to use their influence to press for an end to the use of indiscriminate weapons and to take steps to ensure unhindered humanitarian access to all people in need throughout Syria. And I sincerely hope that progress will be made and that the incoming year finally sees an end to the conflict in Syria. We simply cannot squander this moment or momentum. All of us must stand up and play our part to bring an end to this conflict once and for all. Thank you.
I thank Mr. O'Brien for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Zainab Hawa Bangura.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, I would like to thank you for extending an invitation for me to brief the Security Council. However, before beginning, I wish to express my solidarity with the survivors and families of all those who lost loved ones in the horrific attacks in Paris, Beirut, Tunis, Sharm el-Sheikh, and elsewhere. These depraved acts of terror must reinforce our collective resolve. In my previous briefings to this Council, I have detailed the nature, trends, and patterns of conflict-related sexual violence in Syria. Women and girls in the theaters of this conflict find themselves under assault every day and at every point of their lives, whether at border crossings or checkpoints, during house searches or in detention centers, in areas under government control or areas where ISIL and a plethora of armed groups operate. They have been affected in a unique and systematic manner as a result of numerous factors, including the extraordinary scale of the displacement and humanitarian situation so well articulated by my colleague, Stephen Brown, and the sophistication and strategy of the key players, including extremist groups, as well as the regional nature of the conflict and the cross-border dimensions. Sexual violence has been a characteristic of the Syrian conflict and has been perpetrated by most of the belligerent parties as a tactic of war. I am pleased, therefore, that this Council has now also expressed through Resolution 2242 our involving understanding of how sexual violence is being used to advance fundamental strategic objective of extremist groups in Syria and elsewhere as a tactic of terrorism. It is critical that we unpack this concept further and in the process take the protection and empowerment of women and girls from the periphery to the center of our global, regional, and national counter-terrorism strategies. Today, I would like to focus my remarks primarily on how we can respond. Since returning from my scoping visit to the region this May, I have focused considerable energy on raising the level of awareness and understanding of the sexual violence crimes that are occurring. At the same time, we have been working to formulate a response strategy. Our response has to go beyond security and military considerations. It must encompass legislative and service delivery dimensions, and accountability must be a central consideration. At the same time, we have to deepen political commitment of leaders, particularly at regional, national, and local level. We must deepen the base of information and analysis. And because of the cross-border dimensions, our strategy also requires a concerted regional response, including improved information sharing across countries. To address conflict-related sexual violence in Syria and the region requires a unified, comprehensive, and multi-sectorial approach. The strategy, which is being developed under the auspices of my office, the team of experts, and the UN Action, has 7 areas under which a range of interventions will be required. First, we must continue to mobilize political commitments, support, and resources. This political commitment must come at all levels, starting in the conflict-affected countries themselves. Unfortunately, since my visit, we have yet not been able to agree on specific commitments and measures with authorities in both Syria and Iraq. However, at the regional level, I am pleased to report that we are concluding a framework of cooperation with the League of Arab States, which can catalyze some of the critical legislative reforms and protection policies that are required. Second, as I have already emphasized, we must ensure that protection and empowerment of women is consistently included as a central consideration in all efforts to prevent violent extremism and counterterrorism, including the Secretary General's Plan of Action to prevent violent extremism. Third, we must undertake legislative and other measures to enhance protection, early warning, and risk mitigation. This includes programs to support civil society, local communities, and women's groups who are the front line. Legislative frameworks have to be strengthened to protect and mitigate risk for refugees and IDPs, a majority of whom are women and girls, and to secure the status of thousands of children who risk becoming stateless generations. Fourth, we have to strengthen the support and service to survivors of sexual violence. There is an acute lack of health and other critical services for survivors within Syria as well as in neighboring countries. And this services should extend to livelihood support and poverty alleviation programs. Fifth, no meaningful actions can be taken in the absence of knowledge. Therefore, we must invest in deepening information, analysis, and documentation on sexual violence as a basis for advocacy and action at all levels. Sixth, we must be relentless in our pursuit of accountability through investigation and prosecution of sexual violence crimes. Combating impunity is a key aspect of deterrence and ultimately prevention. This will primarily entail support to national institutions, and at global and regional level, it will require new approaches and frameworks to deal with unprecedented jurisdictional and other challenges associated with thousands of combatants from over 100 different countries. And finally, we must live up to our frequent declarations to ensure women's participation in peace and mediation processes and the explicit inclusion of conflict-related sexual violence concerns in these discussions. Women and girls are disproportionately affected, and they must have a seat at the table. As the women themselves have stated, nothing about us without us. The strategy envisions targeted initiatives under these 7 priority areas. These initiatives are intended to be catalytic in nature, filling critical gaps and strengthen the overall response. In my capacity as chair of the UN Action, which brings together 13 UN entities, I will encourage this network to propose and take the lead on specific initiatives in accordance with their respective mandates, expertise, and comparative advantages. The strategy should articulate a shared vision of priorities, and in so doing, enhance overall coordination. Your political and financial support and that of other member states and donors will be absolutely crucial. I look forward in the coming weeks and months to share more details about the strategy, and we rely on your steadfast commitment. Distinguished members of the Security Council, last week I was in Amman, Jordan, to attend a meeting organized by the Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide and the Responsibility to Protect, with 25 religious leaders and representatives of faith-based organizations from the Middle East and North Africa. The discussions reinforce my conviction that the role of community, religious and traditional leaders is critical to break the prevailing silence around the issue of conflict-related sexual violence and ensure that survivors are embraced by their families and communities rather than stigmatized and shunned. The role of religious and traditional leaders is essential to develop and sustain a counter-narrative to ISIL and other extremist groups who pervert the inherited message of peace, tolerance, and respect for women, which is at the heart of Islam. It is essential that we engage and empower them as one of the crucial vanguards in this battle. It will not be enough to defeat ISIL militarily. We must also defeat the ideology they are propagating. I would like to conclude by flagging one of the greatest challenges of this agenda for Syria and the Middle East and beyond. How do we enforce compliance of the non-state actors who are the main perpetrators around the world? This will also require new approaches and tools. Obviously, it will not be possible to engage with terrorist groups like ISIL and other extremists of their kind. However, we will need to make calculated and strategic decisions regarding engagement with non-state actors to ensure that they know that the light of justice will shine on them, and that they must undertake specific measures to prevent and punish sexual violence. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Bangura for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. LEILA ZERROUGUI.
Thanks, Madame President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de présenter mes condoléances aux représentants de la France,
to the permanent representative of France and the French people,
avec nous, peuple libanais, ainsi
and
qu'à toutes
the
les
representatives of other peoples who are with us, like the Lebanese people, and all the victims of extreme violence. The recent dreadful attacks which took place in Paris and Beirut recall to us in the most tragic fashion that we are all vulnerable to violent extremism. Today, more than ever, we must come together and work together to find solutions to the extended conflicts that can feed these acts of terror.
I would like to thank the United Kingdom during its presidency of the Security Council and the Secretary of State for International Development for this opportunity to brief you on the situation of children affected by armed conflict in Syria. The conflict in Syria continues to have disastrous humanitarian consequences for children, and I think that Stephen already highlighted some of what is happening. After 5 years of intensifying hostilities and in the absence of a political solution, fundamental principles of international humanitarian and human rights law continue to be violated daily. The increasing outflow of refugees and internal displacement demonstrate the deteriorating situation. Half of the Syrian population is now displaced. Half of the displaced are children. Madam President, children are paying a high price for the ongoing conflict. They continue to be killed, maimed, recruited, and used, abducted, and exploited by parties to conflict. Their future are jeopardized by attacks on schools. Drawing open information documented through the monitoring and reporting mechanism in 2015, my briefing will focus on 3 of the 6 grave violations, namely killing and maiming of children, recruitment and use, attacks on schools. It will complement briefings by my esteemed colleagues. Mr. O'Brien has already briefed you on civilian casualties of the conflict. The cumulative death toll of children was estimated at 10,000 in 2014 and is expected to have increased significantly in 2015. The majority of children have been killed or injured as a result of indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas perpetrated by all parties to the conflict in violation of international humanitarian law. Aerial bombardments of civilian areas by Syrian government forces, including the use of barrel bombs and successive airstrikes, have continued to cause a significant proportion of verified child casualties in 2015. For example, in May, a barrel bomb attack on a school in Aleppo city killed 6 children and injured 20. The indiscriminate shelling of densely populated areas, including mortar and rocket attacks, is another major cause of child casualties. For example, on 15 September, 19 children were killed and another 85 injured by more than 100 rockets and mortars fired by armed opposition groups in the Salah ad-Din area of Aleppo city. On 26 September, another 19 children were killed and 21 injured by a mortar fired from a government position into a park in Homs. ISIL has committed brutal atrocities against children. While it has been difficult to verify cases of grave violation occurring in ISIL-controlled areas, the killing and maiming of children by this group continue to be reported. This includes recent horrific video footage allegedly portraying the mass execution of 200 children. It has also been reported that children recruited by ISIL have been executed for trying to escape. With the growing number of parties involved in the conflict, the risk of grave violations against children increases. It is reported that children have also been killed and maimed in airstrikes conducted by international forces. I reiterate that all parties to conflict must abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law, in particular the principle of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. The ongoing use of methods and means of warfare which fail to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and the use of indiscriminate weapons in populated areas are a clear violation of these obligations. Madam President, a continuing feature of the conflict in Syria is the widespread recruitment and use of children by all non-state armed groups, including YPG, FSA, and government-affiliated groups. ISIL and Nusra Front have also recruited and used children to perpetrate acts of extreme violence. Reports have been received of armed groups targeting children as young as 7 years of age and forcibly recruiting children through coercion of family and abductions. ISIL allegedly recruited up to 400 children in the first quarter of 2015. And the United Nations has verified cases of their use of foreign children. Indoctrination and military training of children play an important role in recruitment and use by ISIL and Al-Nusra Front. Children have received military training in 3 ISIL centers in Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, and Raqqa. In addition, ISIL has opened kindergarten for boys in Raqqa, and the Nusra Front has instructed communities in Idlib to send boys aged 8 to 12 to their education camps. Syrian government forces have arrested and detained children for alleged association with armed groups. There are verified cases of children who were subjected to torture during detention and of the death of children in custody. I reiterate that children recruited and used by armed groups are victims and should be treated as such. Madam President, at the end of September 2015, over a quarter of all schools in Syria, about 6,000 schools, were fully or partially destroyed. The United Nations has verified attacks on schools by Syrian government forces, ISIL and Nusra Front, and other non-state armed groups in 2015. In addition, the military use of schools by Syrian government forces in Idlib has led to their targeting by armed opposition groups. Prior to the conflict, primary school enrollment was almost universal in Syria. Now, the right to education has been compromised by hostilities, displacement, and restriction in ISIL-held areas. An estimated 2 million internally displaced children and 700,000 refugee children are not attending schools. We are witnessing a generation at risk of not receiving an education, with serious long-term consequences for the future of these children. We can mitigate these consequences if the international community makes significant investment in protecting education and in providing education in emergencies. Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 5 years of conflict in Syria has taken an immeasurable toll on the lives of children. I urge all parties to respect their obligation in the international law and all grave violations against children and pursue accountability for violation. To this end, it is critical that every member state with influence on the parties to the conflict play a constructive role. Since my first visit to Syria in 2012, I have repeatedly stated that there is no military solution to the conflict in Syria. Finally, there is now a broader consensus that a political solution must be reached. The acknowledgement of the linkage between a ceasefire and a parallel political process by the International Syria Support Group in Vienna this weekend, and the willingness of participants to encourage confidence-building measures that contribute to a viable political process and a nationwide ceasefire are important and constructive development. In this context, I underscore that the issue of children has proven to be a positive entry point in a number of peace processes, and strengthening the protection of children must be at the center of any peace talk. It is our collective responsibility to support a political solution to the conflict, accompanied by concrete commitments and actions to bring an end to the conflict and suffering. I call on all of you to be the voices of the children in Syria and to take collective action to allow them to live a life free from fear and violence. Thank you.
I thank Ms. ZERROUGUI for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Secretary of State for International Development of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Let me thank Stephen O'Brien, Zainab Bangouri and LEILA ZERROUGUI for their sobering briefings. And indeed, the UK expresses its condolences in relation to the terrorist attacks over recent days in Paris, Beirut and elsewhere. They are a vivid reminder of the horrific human toll of the Syria and regional crisis. Like others here today, I've met Syrian refugees who have fled the bloodshed and violence consuming their country for over 4 years now. And their tales are of experiences that no one should have to go through. But we must accept that these people have been let down. The generosity of countries bearing the brunt of the refugees, like Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey, has not been matched by similar generosity from the whole international community. UN appeals are 45% funded. Overwhelming suffering and loss has been matched by political deadlock and an inadequate financial response. My message to the Council today is that for Syria, for its people, for us all, time is now running out. Time is running out for us to meet the most basic needs of the Syrian people, whether they are inside Syria or have fled the country. Time is running out for Syria's children, a whole generation who are being robbed of a childhood, an education and a future. And time is running out for the international community as we try to cope with the overwhelming number of refugees who have themselves run out of hope and are now looking elsewhere to build a new life for themselves and their families. Since day one, Britain has worked hard to help people on the ground and been at the forefront of the humanitarian response to this crisis, pledging $1.7 billion to date. But the need is immense and growing. Greater efforts are needed not only to meet people's basic needs, but to provide jobs and an education for Syria's children. That's why our Prime Minister has just announced that the UK will co-host a global conference on the Syria crisis in February next year. This conference must be a turning point. It must raise the resources and deliver the policy changes that are needed. Let's not forget, our response to this crisis, the actions we take or don't take on Syria, will define how we respond to other protracted emergencies. The challenge of educating whole generations of children at risk of being lost to conflict, and with forced displacement likely to remain a major feature of the global landscape, the challenge of supporting refugees and the countries that host them. But we recognise that humanitarian action alone is not sufficient. Syria isn't a natural disaster, it's a man-made one. We all know what's causing the deaths and suffering. The Assad regime bears the primary responsibility. It's Assad barrel bombs, but it's ISIL's brutality too. It's the targeting and the killing of aid workers. It's the deliberate disregard for international humanitarian law, too often dressed up in a false, perverse argument of sovereignty. A negotiated political transition is the sole way to end the conflict in Syria and is key to alleviating the humanitarian crisis. I am encouraged by the constructive discussions in Vienna and the new momentum behind a process working towards peace for the people of Syria. But until that political settlement is reached, we must recommit to ending targeted and indiscriminate attacks on civilians, particularly aerial attacks and shelling, to the protection of health facilities, schools and essential infrastructure, ensuring unimpeded access for humanitarian organisations, and an end to the use of siege tactics, and preventing and responding to gender-based violence. As is the case in all conflicts, girls and women have been left the most vulnerable to violence, abuse and exploitation. As we meet today, there is a long list of things that we will fail to agree on in relation to the Syria crisis. But help for those caught up in this crisis, humanitarian aid being able to reach those in need, these things shouldn't be on that list. These are things that we should be able to agree to. There can be no excuse for flouting humanitarian law. There can be no excuse for preventing humanitarian agencies from reaching those in need. The Council must make that clear. We agreed Resolution 2191 on allowing the UN to use cross-border routes. This resolution has been critical for helping us get aid to people who otherwise would have had none. It is essential that we renew that resolution. Syria is perhaps the defining conflict of our age, not just for those in the region, but for all of us. It has shown all too clearly where there are failures in our humanitarian and political responses. And the World Humanitarian Summit next year will be a vital moment for us to commit to a new 21st century response to protracted crises that brings together our development, humanitarian work, and human rights. And in this age of crisis, this summit is a vital moment to recommit our humanitarian values and law. And as UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon and the International Committee for the Red Cross President Peter Maurer have said, now is the moment to rally for humanity. We must respond to that call for the sake of Syria and for the wider world and for future generations. This is our shared responsibility and challenge, and we must meet it. Thank you. I now resume my position as President, my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to other members of the Security Council. I give the floor to the representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, Madam President. New Zealand too expresses our condolences for the recent loss of life in Paris and Beirut, as well as attacks in Ankara, Egypt, Iraq and beyond. We must do all we can to counter ISIL. This includes finding a political resolution to the Syrian conflict, which is a major driver of ISIL. These attacks show that the human cost of the conflict reaches well beyond Syria. Within Syria, however, too, it continues to escalate. 21 months ago, this Council passed Resolution 2139 on Syria, which demanded that all parties immediately cease and desist from all violations of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses. This call has not been heeded. A brutal and lawless conflict continues. Human rights violations and abuses can lead to and fuel conflict. They underpin many of the conflicts which come before this Council, and this is especially evident in Syria. A common feature of conflict is the disproportionate impact that it has on the most vulnerable. This is true in Syria for women and for children. As we've heard today, 2.7 million Syrian children have been deprived of their right to education, some for 4 years or more. The fact that more than half of all attacks on schools worldwide over the last 4 years took place in Syria says it all. As we've heard today from other colleagues, children continue to be recruited and indoctrinated by ISIL and non-state armed groups. Women and girls inside Syria and those who have fled the conflict are subjected to sexual and gender-based violence, sexual exploitation and harassment. The desperate economic situation of families is exploited, with young girls coerced into early marriages. ISIL must be singled out for its brutal campaign of sexual violence. Sexual violence is not a woman's issue, it is a weapon of war. It terrorizes individuals and it destabilizes families and communities. We need to move beyond the narrative of women being victims of conflict. They must be provided the opportunity to be powerful agents of change in transforming their societies. Syrian women have shown immense resilience and strength. At the political level, Syrian women must be included in policy dialogues about Syria's future, as called for by Special Envoy de Mistura last week and has been echoed here today. At the community level, the views of women must be included in needs assessments, program design, implementation and evaluations of humanitarian and development programs. Madam President, accountability for international humanitarian law violations and human rights abuses in Syria is not optional. It is essential for justice and it is essential for healing. New Zealand is working with Jordan and Spain to renew Security Council Resolution 2191, which has enabled cross-border access of humanitarian assistance into Syria. 2191 has enabled the delivery of non-food humanitarian items and medical supplies for millions of people. However, millions more remain hard to reach, including those in besieged areas who are intentionally denied basic necessities as a cruel tactic of war. New Zealand is concerned that cross-line obstructed, particularly by the Syrian government. Humanitarian access into ISIL-controlled areas remains almost non-existent. New Zealand supports the efforts of Special Envoy de Mistura, but he needs the support of the international community. In this regard, New Zealand welcomes the ongoing talks in Vienna. They are an important step towards a political solution, affirming the benefits of pragmatism and diplomacy. We also welcome the agreement of the International Syria Support Group to encourage confidence-building measures by parties on the ground, including better implementation of Resolutions 2139, 2165 and 2191, increased humanitarian access, and an end to the use of indiscriminate weapons. These measures will advance the political process, which is the only real answer to the humanitarian crisis. They will also protect civilians in the short term. Their implementation is long overdue. Finally, we welcome the strong role envisaged for the Security Council by the Vienna process. We look forward to working closely with Council members to reinforce progress and to engage on questions emerging from the Vienna process. New Zealand is encouraged to see momentum building towards finding a political solution. It is shameful that it has taken nearly 5 years, well over 250,000 people dead, 4.2 million people, which is almost the exact population of New Zealand, fleeing Syria to get where we are today. We must commit to ensuring that now is the beginning of the end of the conflict in Syria. And in this regard, we welcome the UK's announcement of a global Syria crisis conference early next year. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of New Zealand for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Thank you, Madam President. Before
I begin my statement, I would like to renew the expressions of solidarity of my delegation with the people and government of France. You can always count on Spain as your neighboring, allied and friendly country.
Madam Secretary
of State, I'm grateful that you have convened this briefing on the humanitarian situation in Syria from several perspectives, which are all equally important. I'd also like to thank Mr. O'Brien, Ms. Bangura and Ms. ZERROUGUI for their briefings. We have been moved and concerned by those briefings, but we should be moved above all to action. The situation of women and children in the Syrian conflict is the deepest circle of the hell that country has become. As Ms. ZERROUGUI said in her recent report, there are millions of children affected by war, and we can expect them to bear the scars for the rest of their lives of this very traumatic experience. We have a basic duty, which is to feed them, care for their lives, their health, their education, even in conflict zones. But many of them, even the majority, are going to need a lot of assistance for quite a long time after. We want to stress once again the ruinous state of the educational system in Syria, where there are 2 million children without schools and 700,000 children in neighboring countries that have taken them in. Thousands of schools have been destroyed or are being used for non-educational purposes, in contravention of international humanitarian law and the precepts of this Council itself. We must do something about this, beginning by responding to the response plan for Syria. At least $224 million are needed to prevent Syria from losing an entire generation to this war. Without any doubt, one of the most deleterious effects on children in Syria is the recruitment and use of children in combat by terrorist groups and other armed non-state actors. The indoctrination of children by these groups creates a risk of feeding the seeds of hate that can easily be reproduced in the future. The use of sexual violence in conflict in Syria is also devastating. All parties are using this as a terrorist tactic, and it has been aptly demonstrated. This must stop immediately. The victims of this violence must receive help in the form of specialized care, which unfortunately is not always available. The role of women in Syria also should be seen from other points of view. An essential one is the full participation of women in an inclusive political process, which should lead to a peaceful Syria, and looking at all walks of life of the new Syria that we all long to see. Now, without this being less important, I have left to the end the references to the presentation made by Mr. O'Brien. In this regard, I wish once again to emphatically condemn the indiscriminate attacks on the civilian population by all parties to the conflict, including, in particular, the use of barrel bombs, and we call on the Council to swiftly adopt measures in this regard. As my colleague of New Zealand said, this Council very soon is going to focus on the renewal of Resolution 2191 on humanitarian assistance, transboundary humanitarian assistance, the effectiveness of which has been demonstrated since the process of renewal of this resolution should also be an opportunity which we should not fail to make the most of to deal with other essential aspects of humanitarian protection, such as the lifting of siege on besieged areas and medical neutrality. I believe, like all of the speakers, that none of the efforts we will make in the humanitarian area will be enough without adopting a political solution as well, a political solution which will pass through a transition period and go on to an inclusive government where the population of Syria will be fully represented and with sufficient legitimacy to push forward a legitimate change in the country along the lines of the Geneva Communique. We are closely following the diplomatic steps being taken in Vienna, and we welcome the roadmap adopted in Vienna on the 14th, which demonstrates the shared determination to put an end to the killing in Syria. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Spain for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Jordan.
شكرا سيدتي الرئيس واسمحوا لي في البداية أن أرحب بمعالي وزيرة التنمية الدولية
welcome Her Excellency Secretary of State and to express thanks and appreciation to the UK for convening this meeting. Thanks and appreciation also go to the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflicts and the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict on their comprehensive briefings. We express sincere condolences to the friendly people of France and to the French government. We condemn in the strongest terms the terrorist attacks that beset Paris. We stand shoulder to shoulder with France and with all international efforts in combating terrorism. We condemn all terrorist acts that took place in Beirut, Ankara, Iraq, Egypt, and all fraternal and friendly countries. And we affirm our stance with them in combating terrorism. We are deeply saddened at the situation in our neighbor, Syria, our fraternal neighbor, Syria. Over the past 5 years, the humanitarian scene is staggering. I will not give you statistics nor figures. The deep suffering goes beyond the comprehension of humanity and the civilized world. Violation of basic rules of the international humanitarian law and human rights law by the conflicting parties in Syria has become a hallmark of the conflict there. The indiscriminate bombing of innocent civilians, including children, has become a daily scene, let alone displacement, starvation, destruction of infrastructure, bombing schools and health centers, hindering medical assistance and life-saving assistance, intimidation, obliterating of the Syrian identity, and plundering of historic artifacts. The international community should explore every possibility in order to improve the humanitarian affairs in Syria. We will cooperate with New Zealand and Spain in order to renew Resolution 2191 in order to secure the ongoing delivery of humanitarian assistance that saved millions of Syrians. The international community should work and should make concerted, unified efforts in order to fight terrorist groups, notably ISIL, that continues to control large areas of Syria, wreaking havoc, whose actions have continued, especially the coward actions that took place in France, Lebanon, and Iraq of late.
والأردن المحدود بموارده يتعامل اليوم
We are dealing with the most important humanitarian asylum crisis in the world after the Second World War. We are the largest host of refugees in the world and the second largest host of Syrian refugees compared to the number of our population. Syrian citizens account for 1.5 million people living in different areas of Jordan. 9% of Syrian refugees dwell camps. This has put tremendous pressures on health, education, food security, employment, and put tremendous pressures on the public treasury in Jordan at a time when we are facing economic challenges due to the regional situation. We are sharing with them our resources and our infrastructures that are fatigued by all this responsibility and the heavy burden. The kingdom and its good people have opened their homes to refugees from all the region. We will continue to pursue this generous approach under the leadership of our Hashemite leaders. However, the international community should back up countries that are hosting Syrian refugees that start to feel that the world betrayed them due to insufficient international support. Syria and other countries hosting Syrian refugees are facing serious deterioration in the delivery of basic services. There are setbacks in development at all levels. Therefore, the international community should coordinate and cooperate with governments of the host countries in order to secure a reasonable future for those whose lives have been shattered due to these tragedies. The international community should buttress the resilience of those countries because that has to do with the interest of the whole world. We are thankful to the UNDP for organizing the development for the promotion of abilities to face crises symposium, which starts a new period to support Syrian refugees and a new international partnership to that end. We continue to work in order for the Council to maintain the item on the Syrian refugees in its agenda and its deliberations. Due to the serious consequences of the Syrian crisis for the whole world, we stress the importance of the implementation of the presidential statement that the Council adopted in April this year, and we should build on it. There is no humanitarian solution to the crisis in Syria. Rather, there should be a comprehensive political solution to the Syrian crisis. We welcome the Vienna meeting and the ministerial declaration of Vienna. The great number of participants made the Vienna meeting a historic one. However, we should build on it in order to launch a political process in order to achieve political transition and to realize the aspiration of the Syrian people. The comprehensive political solution is the only solution to this crisis, which should be based on Geneva 1. There is global agreement on that. It should meet the aspirations of all components of the Syrian people. It should achieve a transition to a new political reality that enjoys the blessings of all the components of the Syrian people and that enables us to defeat terrorism in Syria. and that will lead to the return of stability and security in Syria, and that will lead to the voluntary return of IDPs and the Syrian refugees to their country and to maintain the independence of Syria.
I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you so much, Madam President. At the outset, of course, we would like to again express our deep sympathy and condolences to the people and government of France, to Paris, and to all countries and to all people, to all cities who fell victim to this horrid terrorist attacks. And some of them have been facing the terrorist threat on a daily basis. In expressing our condolences, we would like to state our solidarity in the fight, the joint fight against terrorism, loudly and clearly. Madam President, we'd like to start by extending our gratitude to the Undersecretary General for having presented the report. And of course, we have to pay tribute to all of the humanitarian workers, UN and other international organization staff who are working in Syria and very often risking their very lives by helping those who require medical assistance, food, and indeed housing. Enormous humanitarian efforts are being undertaken. Every month, over 4 million individuals receive food assistance. The system for the delivery and distribution of humanitarian assistance across borders, pursuant to Security Council Resolution 2165 and under UN oversight, is working effectively. By the end of October, over 207 convoys crossed Turkey's and Jordan's borders. This is over 4,500 truckloads. A great deal is being done by the Syrian government in ensuring the delivery of humanitarian shipments, not only in territory under their control, where most of the IDPs are concentrated, but also in territory which is beyond its control, as the Secretary General's report states. What should also be praised are the very noble actions of the people of Syria themselves, whether we're referring here to Red Crescent volunteers who provide basic necessity products across front lines, or individuals who host refugees in their homes. It's entirely clear that regardless of what the humanitarian efforts are, regardless of how many convoys are sent across borders or front lines, this problem will not be solved in this way. It is only through achieving a political settlement with, in parallel, a determined fight against terrorism that we will achieve a real and viable improvement in the situation. The international community must combine its efforts in its fight against a terrorist threat, from which the people of Syria have already suffered for 5 years now, which knows and recognizes no boundaries to its barbarism, nor respects any geographical borders. And this is something that we saw yet again, based on the tragedies in Beirut, Paris, Baghdad, Ankara, and other cities. The participants of the support group for Syria in Vienna on November 14th condemned these terrorist acts. Furthermore, they set out concrete steps to progress the political process in Syria and underscored the importance of ensuring humanitarian access to all parts of the country. At this current, very decisive stage in stepping up political efforts, what is especially unacceptable is the politicization of human rights and humanitarian topics. Engaging in speculation with humanitarian issues in an attempt to score political points is simply immoral. In this context, we are outraged by different types of information regarding alleged civilian deaths and destruction of civilian infrastructure as a result of missile and airstrikes by the Russian armed forces. The operations of the Russian Air Force and Space Forces are covered in daily briefings for both Russian and foreign journalists. During these briefings, an objective picture is drawn, and attempts at disinformation are allayed. For example, The media had information regarding the airstrike on October 20th of a hospital in Sarmina, as a result of which, allegedly, and this is something which was claimed by this and confirmed by the media, there were civilian casualties. This is something which is also referred to by the Secretary General's report in paragraph 4. The media spread photographs of a destroyed building. However, on satellite pictures which were taken on October 31st, the hospital in Sarmina is clearly whole and hasn't been damaged at all. Again, the use of only verified, confirmed, reliable information remains one of the main criteria to ensure the unbiased, impartial nature of the UN system. And we noted that the Secretary General's report this time has been drawn up in a more balanced way, insofar as it doesn't have any hasty assessments and unconfirmed data on possible civilian casualties. We regret the fact that those who drafted this report were not brave enough to allay the disinformation regarding the actions of the Russian Federation's air forces, which were contained in the previous report. Russia continues to provide the suffering Syrian population with humanitarian assistance. A great many flights of the Russian Ministry for Emergency Affairs are providing basic goods to Syria. We have handed over 100,000 tons of wheat to Damascus. We are also providing assistance through UN channels, including to the World Food Programme, as well as the UN Development Programme. The path to a sustainable political settlement and effectively fighting terrorism lies through a combining of international and regional efforts. There is growing understanding of the need to create a comprehensive, united anti-terrorist coalition under UN aegis. Terrorist attacks, recent terrorist attacks, have clearly shown that not only can terrorism not be justified in any way, but what cannot be justified is the passivity and the lack of unity in the fight against this evil. We stand ready to continue joint work in this field. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Madam President, our hearts go out to those who are mourning their loved ones after the latest terrorist attacks. I thank the UK Presidency for convening this Open Security Council briefing. I also thank the briefers for their statements, reports of unvarnished quality on the harrowing consequences of nearly 5 years of brutal war on the people of Syria. As we consider the positive signals emerging from Vienna, all those people have is more bloodshed and displacement. Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey are approaching a dangerous saturation point as refugees continue to spill out of Syria. While criminal smugglers and traffickers are profiting, gaining millions from tragedy, refugees are dying literally to escape. As per the Syrian Network for Human Rights, government forces dropped nearly 1,500 barrel bombs in a month of October alone. Indiscriminate attacks against and abuse of civilians continues from all sides of the conflict. Starvation and siege are used as a tool of war. Daesh butchers keep committing gruesome atrocities, public executions, stonings, beheadings, and rapes. It is unthinkable that in the 21st century, slave markets are up and running with women and girls paraded and sold like cattle. Humanitarian access remains a huge problem due to insecurity as well as artificial hurdles. Administrative visa procedures continue to delay and limit the delivery of assistance by UN agencies and their partners, including humanitarian NGOs. It is immoral and criminal to obstruct humanitarian access. Every minute counts. Every day means more lives lost. All those acts constitute glaring violations of the provisions contained in Security Council Resolution 2139 and subsequent resolutions. The Council's inability to enforce its own resolutions in the face of the biggest humanitarian crisis of the 21st century undercuts its relevance and credibility. The Council should use all the tools at its disposal to ensure that the parties to this conflict allow rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access for UN humanitarian agencies and their implementing partners, including across conflict lines. We need to increase and expand access to the millions of people living in all hard-to-reach areas, also in view of the coming winter, which will further aggravate the immense suffering of the people in need. Madam President, the ongoing conflict has deprived the Syrian people of even the basic medical care. Physicians for Human Rights documented 307 attacks on medical facilities and the deaths of 670 medical personnel in Syria since the start of the conflict in March 2011, with Syrian forces responsible for 90% of these attacks. Concerns about safety and security of humanitarian personnel too remain high, with UN vehicles attacked and humanitarian workers kidnapped and killed. We condemn the continued attacks on healthcare and humanitarian facilities, transportation and personnel, and reiterate that they hold a special protected status under international humanitarian law, which must be respected at all circumstances. Furthermore, such attacks may constitute war crimes and have to be taken most seriously. Impunity runs rampant in Syria. A much-needed referral of the country's situation to the ICC was blocked by a veto last year, one of the 4 vetoes that allowed this crisis to deepen and expand by protecting the perpetrators, not the victims. We support the recent calls of Secretary General to refer Syria to ICC and urge the international community not to let accountability become yet another victim of Syria's war. We commend the work done by Commission of Inquiry and human rights organizations to register the atrocities and human rights violations in Syria and urge them to continue their important work with the hope that one day, hopefully sooner than later, the testimonies they collect will help to bring the perpetrators to account. Madam President, Syria remains one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a child and a veritable hell to be born a girl. 7.5 million Syrian children have lost their parents, their homes and their schools, have suffered immense emotional and physical traumas. According to UNHCR, more than 140,000 Syrian children are stateless. What future do they have? Illiterate, orphaned, malnourished, and maimed. What future does a country have when its entire next generation is a lost generation? We applaud all those who shine a light on the plight of Syria's children and do their best to provide them with protection, support, and sustenance. They, too, demand justice. Those children don't have the luxury of waiting for Geneva or Vienna or any other format to succeed. By then, many of them will have succumbed, will have been exchanged for food, recruited and ordered to kill, or will have succumbed to the shellings, the aerial attacks, and the barrel bombs. This Council can and should at least act on the barrel bombs to protect those children and the remaining Syrian population. Madam President, to conclude, let me reiterate our long-standing position that there is no military solution to the Syria conflict. The sides must choose a negotiations table over violence and proceed on the basis of a Geneva communique of 2012, building on the glimmer of hope that Vienna now offers. But that road will be long and full of hurdles. It requires time, which the people of Syria don't have. This Council must do all within its power to make sure that those for whom the peace is being built will see it alive. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Angola.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, let me express once again, on behalf of the Angolan delegation, our sincere condolence and solidarity to the delegation of France because of the attacks in Paris, and to condemn strongly those barbarous acts. Madam President, we thank Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Stephen O'Brien, as well as Mrs. LEILA and Ms. Zainaba Bangura for their comprehensive presentations on the humanitarian situation and challenge facing the Syrian population. It is deeply troubling to bear witness to constant violations of human rights and international humanitarian law by the parties to the conflict and to the continued suffering of communities and individuals inside Syria. The massive refugee crisis facing Syria's neighbors, and now Europe, is one of the consequences of the international community's inability to promote and facilitate a political solution to this conflict. Additionally, growing extremism radicalization and nationalist reaction will truly leave a bitter legacy with long-term consequences that will affect the region and the world as a whole. Madam President, we have a common responsibility of solving this crisis, and as such, we must step up efforts in supporting the talks being held in Vienna for a political settlement to this irrational conflict. The countries participating in the political process, including the permanent members of the Security Council, having anticipated leverage over the warring parties, bear special responsibility to work together to putting resolute pressure on the parties to end violence. The Vienna talks are a worldwide effort. We are pleased that agreement has been reached for the holding of talks between the government and the opposition in January, and also on ways to enforce a ceasefire. We believe that the establishment of a ceasefire and ending the proliferation and supply of weapons and the logistical support for the rival groups on the ground is a top priority. Only then will the Syrian people feel a genuine commitment by the relevant actors and stakeholders to reach a comprehensive peace process responding to their basic aspiration for peace and respect. Madam President, Security Council Resolution 2139, 2165, and 2191 were determined effort by the Security Council to address human rights issues, underlining the Syrian conflict and find ways to alleviate the suffering of populations under extremely stressful conditions of suffering and despair. However, at this point, we must forcefully insist that the parties in conflict show respect for civilians' rights of access to basic necessities, including shelter, food, water, and medical care. The conflict has been going on for far too long. It reached such irrational proportions, and the disregard for human rights and international humanitarian law is unacceptable. The circumstance imposed upon us to urge all actors, Syrian and outside powers, to cease all hostilities and reach a political settlement to the conflict. Moreover, we must ensure that the outcome of the peace process and the political transition will hold accountable the perpetrators of atrocities and gross violations of human rights as a prerequisite for a true healing and reconciliation process among Syrians. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Angola for his statement, and I now give the floor to the United States representative.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Undersecretary General O'Brien and Special Representatives Bangura and ZERROUGUI, for your deeply sobering briefings. Reflecting on your statements and on the Secretary General's report on the humanitarian situation in Syria, it is disturbing to hear yet again that the security situation has deteriorated and that humanitarian access to those most in need has not improved. Before addressing some of the issues you raised today, I want to express also that our thoughts and prayers are with all those affected by the attacks in Paris on Friday, as well as those affected by the attack in Beirut on Thursday. We condemn in the strongest terms these vile terrorist attacks. We must do everything in our power to fight back against what can only be considered as an assault on our common humanity. As the Secretary General and the representatives at this table have said time and time again, the only solution for the crisis in Syria, including the dire humanitarian situation, is a political solution through a Syrian-led political process based on the Geneva Communiqué of 2012. Just 2 days ago, we took a fundamentally important step towards that goal in Vienna. More than 20 stakeholders, including representatives of regional organizations and UN Special Envoy de Mistura, convened on Saturday as members of the International Syria Support Group to discuss how to bring an end to the Syrian conflict as quickly as possible. The group agreed to work to implement a nationwide ceasefire in Syria, which would come into effect as soon as the representatives of the Syrian government and the opposition have begun initial steps towards a transition based on the Geneva Communiqué. A halt in the fighting is absolutely essential in our efforts to address the humanitarian needs of Syrians and to advance a political process to end the conflict. For our part, it will be critical for this Council to support this effort through a resolution of a UN-endorsed monitoring mission for such a ceasefire. As discussed in Vienna, both in the ministerial and in the setting of a working group, it is critical that all parties and the international community work diligently to ensure swift delivery of humanitarian assistance throughout all of Syria through unimpeded delivery approvals and improved access over borders and across conflict lines. Particularly as we look forward to the renewal of Resolution 2191, we must do all that we can to ensure assistance reaches those most in need in Syria. While there is renewed energy to achieve a political solution, the situation on the ground continues to be of significant concern. The tragic suffering of civilians from the persistent fighting and the rabid violations of international law have continued unabated. We are still stunned by the continued use of barrel bombs and other destructive weapons in civilian areas, the attacks on schools, hospitals, and medical personnel, arbitrary arrests and detentions, sexual and gender-based violence, torture, and disappearances. The Syrian Network for Human Rights recorded 1,771 deaths in Syria in just the month of October, including 1,284 individuals at the hands of government forces, which clearly remain responsible for the overwhelming majority of deaths in Syria. Further, despite its claim to the contrary, the regime's ghastly use of barrel bombs did not stop last month. Syrian documentation groups recorded the regime's use of 1,438 barrel bombs in October alone. In recent weeks, airstrikes, including those involving barrel bombs, intensified in opposition-held eastern Ghouta, resulting in the destruction of medical centers, markets, and other public locations. On October 30th, multiple airstrikes on a public market in Douma killed at least 70 people and injured over 500 others, according to relief agencies. These brutal tactics must stop. We underscore the importance that Saturday's Vienna statement recalled Resolution 2139, which includes the demand that all parties cease any indiscriminate use of weapons in populated areas, and welcome the Vienna Group's commitment to press the parties on this issue. Increased fighting in northern Syria, including Russian military operations, has also had a significant impact on the humanitarian situation. In Aleppo, Idlib, and Hama, we have seen about 130,000 newly displaced Syrians in October alone. As the Secretary General of the United Nations has said, attacks on healthcare facilities, transports, and medical personnel have a devastating multiplier effect by killing civilians, but also by degrading the capacity to provide the care people so desperately need. Medical facilities and personnel continue to be attacked, as Undersecretary General O'Brien noted. Furthermore, schools, too, continue to be attacked. Over 2 million children, 1 out of 3, are not in school in Syria. This, too, has a devastating multiplier effect. If the children cannot be protected and educated, then Syria's future generations are at risk. As Madame Bangura has reported, In Syria and elsewhere, rape and sexual violence continue to be used as an instrument of war. This is a vile crime against humanity that affects all walks of life in Syria, men, women, boys, and girls, and it must end. Children are also suffering tremendously, as Madame ZERROUGUI has reported, as these children are forcibly recruited to be used in the conflict as child soldiers, and in some cases as human shields by government-affiliated, and by non-state armed groups, especially ISIL. The United States is grateful to Special Representatives ZERROUGUI and Bangura for ensuring this Council remains informed about these appalling acts. We welcome future briefings that can lead this Council to make more informed decisions on Syria. Human rights violations are also widespread, as thoroughly documented by the UN Commission of Inquiry, which briefed this Council just last week. As the Commission on Inquiry reported, many victims continue to be tortured. The Syrian Network for Human Rights recorded 104 individuals tortured to death in October, including 99 by the regime. ISIL continues to rampantly abuse the basic rights of Syrians. In Raqqa, ISIL arrested a married couple, for example, for teaching mixed groups of boys and girls. ISIL also continued to execute Syrians, whether for perceived spying or for their sexual orientation, as well as to kidnap, enslave, and rape, including girls as young as 9 years old. The overall humanitarian situation in Syria, of course, remains deeply concerning. According to the recently released UN Humanitarian Needs Overview, those in need of urgent humanitarian assistance now total 13.5 million people, an increase of 1.2 million in just over 10 months. At least 8.7 million individuals are unable to fully meet their food needs at present. Meanwhile, 4.5 million people inside Syria continue to live in hard-to-reach areas, nearly half of which are ISIL-controlled. The nearly 400,000 individuals in besieged areas continue to survive in even more dire circumstances. The United States is supporting the UN and non-governmental organizations to prepare an active response for the upcoming winter season, including the distribution of seasonally appropriate relief supplies to more than 1 million people in Syria. As noted in Vienna over the weekend, the resolution of the refugee issue is also important to the final settlement of the Syrian conflict. Yet more needs to be done, and soon. The UN humanitarian response remains only 45% funded. We encourage all countries to consider increased contributions as soon as possible, and to begin considering significant contributions at the 2016 Syria Humanitarian Pledging Conference to be held in London this February. While we pursue a ceasefire and a political solution, we also, of course, need to continue to address the critical needs of Syrians on the ground, and we must do so immediately. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, China thanks the United Kingdom for its initiative to convene today's meeting and welcomes Greening Secretary of State for International Development to chair this meeting. I also wish to thank Under-Secretary General O'Brien and the two SRSGs, Bangura and Zanguri, for their briefings. China expresses condolences to France for the series of terrorist attacks that took place in Paris, and condemns in the strongest terms the barbaric acts of terrorists. We wish to express our deep condolences and deep sympathy to the victims, the bereaved families, and the wounded. Over the past 5 years, the armed conflict among the various Syrian parties is getting more and more violent. ISIS and other terrorist organizations are running rampant, bringing deep suffering to the Syrian people. The international community should push forward its work in a coordinated manner on all three tracks, namely political process, counterterrorism, and easing humanitarian situation, so as to seize a comprehensive and lasting solution to the Syrian crisis. Political settlement is the fundamental way out of the Syrian crisis. At present, the political settlement faces important opportunities. 2 Vienna meetings at the foreign minister level were successfully convened. The participants at the meetings reached important consensus on reaching comprehensive ceasefire, initiating a political process, setting up a Syrian transitional authority, and holding elections. The Syrian International Support Group was initiated officially, and the political settlement has entered a new phase. At the next phase, the key is to ensure its implementation. The parties concerned should do their work respectively and coordinate with each other and under the UN auspices to initiate the process of political transition so as to keep up this hard-won momentum. Terrorism has become the most grave and pressing security challenge facing the international community. The international community must pay high attention to the impact that terrorism has on the Syrian and regional situation. The Security Council has adopted a host of resolutions on counterterrorism, as well as on combating ISIS and other terrorist forces, and has reached a broadly based consensus. The international community must join hands and based on the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, as well as other generally recognized basic norms of international relations, to further strengthen cooperation in counterterrorism. Especially, we must pay attention to addressing both the symptoms and the root causes, and there must be no double standards. The leading role of the United Nations must be brought into full play so as to form a united front on counterterrorism. China, too, is a victim of terrorism. Combating the East Turkestan terrorist forces headed by East Turkestan Islamic Movement must become an important component of the international fight against terrorism. Actively carrying out humanitarian assistance is crucial to ease the situation, the conditions of the Syrian people. China wishes to emphasize the following 3 points. First, China hopes that the United Nations, guided by the principle governing humanitarian assistance, to strengthen its cooperation and engagement with the Syrian government and based on the consent of the country concerned, to scale up its assistance. We call upon the various parties in Syria to put the future and the destiny of the country and the people first, and based on the relevant Security Council resolutions, actively cooperate with the United Nations and other humanitarian assistance. Second, China calls upon the various parties to the conflict in Syria, based on the international humanitarian law, fully carry out the relevant Security Council resolutions, cease attacks, protect infrastructure, medical facilities, and personnel, and effectively honor their obligations to protect civilians. Countries which have influence on the various parties in Syria should do more to this end. Third, China supports the international community in the principle of shared responsibility to scale up its support to Syria and its neighboring countries, and based on the specific needs of the countries concerned, to ensure that aid gets to the people who need it and be put into effective use. We call upon donors to give donations to UN Syria Humanitarian Assistance Response Plan so as to alleviate the financial shortages. China has been making contributions to the easing of the humanitarian situation in Syria, and we have provided over 230 million RMB in aid to the Syrian people as well as to the refugees outside Syria. Not long ago, China decided to provide 100 million RMB to Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. We will continue to do what we can to help in light of the developments and the actual needs. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Venezuela.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President.
Primero, quisiéramos darle la bienvenida.
First of all, we would like to welcome you
nuestros respetos
and pay respectful tribute to you, Madam Christine Green, the Secretary of State for Development of the United Kingdom. Again, we welcome you here. Madam President, we are grateful for the briefing of Mr. Stephen O'Brien, Coordinator of the Office of Humanitarian Affairs. We also congratulate him for the work he is doing as the head of OCHA. We are also grateful for the statements made by the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, Ms. LEILA ZERROUGUI, and the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflicts, Madam Zeynep Bangura. Madam President, before anything else, allow me to express, on behalf of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, our heartfelt condolences to the people and government of France because of the brutal terrorist attacks on civilians. We extend our feelings of solidarity to the families of the victims of these criminal acts, which horrified the world with the vicious cruelty with which they were perpetrated. We also reject the terrorist attack in Beirut, which led to the loss of human lives, and in Lebanon and Turkey, which led to a huge loss of life, as well as the cowardly terrorist attacks which take place daily in Iraq and Syria, countries which constantly suffer the terrorist brutality of ISIS. Venezuela condemns continued acts of violence of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, where the civilian population, especially children, fall victim to the cruelty of those terrorist groups. These deplorable events show us that terrorism knows no borders. It is a threat to international peace and security. If the international community does not act decisively to prevent the financing, training, and transfer of weapons to these groups, as well as their use and encouragement to act as instruments to overthrow governments, Europe and the rest of the world will continue to suffer from terrorist attacks, as is already happening in the Middle East and Northern Africa. Venezuela emphatically condemns terrorism in all its manifestations, as well as violent extremism, whatever its motives may be, and wherever these acts are committed. There is no such thing as a good terrorist. The solution of the humanitarian crisis in the Middle East is connected to the root causes of the conflicts. In this vein, as long as intervention is promoted by supporting terrorist groups, as well as maintaining situations of foreign occupation and repressive policies, we will continue seeing the flow of refugees and internally displaced people fleeing for more to save their lives. Palestine and the crisis in Syria are prime examples of this tragic reality in the Middle East. In this context, our country expresses its deepest concern at the humanitarian situation in the Syrian conflict. 5 years since the hostilities began, the people of Syria has paid a heavy price because of the upsurge of terrorism in that country, which has led to a true humanitarian catastrophe. We acknowledge the selfless effort of humanitarian agencies in Syria, whose work is taking place under very difficult circumstances, which are the result of the same conflict, which has sunk the country and its population into deplorable conditions, to which we add the activities of terrorist groups, ISIS, al-Nusra, Jaish al-Fatah, or Army of Conquest, and associated groups, which make the work of assistance of these humanitarian bodies even more risky. This is why we condemn the attacks against this personnel and the facilities where they do their noble work. We appreciate the level of cooperation between OCHA and the Syrian authorities to resolve ongoing issues on the humanitarian agenda. We hope that this relation will continue to be strengthened in order to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance to alleviate or relieve the pressing needs of the population affected by the war. However, there are some positive aspects in the report of the Secretary General. One of these is the agreement in the area of Zabadani, which led to a ceasefire thanks to the effective action of the United Nations. Another is the fact that 70% of combatants in Qudsiya, Rif Damashq, laid down their arms in a clear attempt to establish negotiations for reconciliation, which is a light of hope. Lastly, the national vaccination campaign in cooperation with the Syrian Ministry of Health to immunize over 2.3 million children on a national level, except for Raqqa. All of these are encouraging signs in the midst of the general tragedy. The areas under ISIS control are a true challenge for humanitarian organizations, as reflected in the report. The World Food Programme is unable to provide assistance to more than 700,000 people needing food. This is an obstacle for humanitarian organizations. We are also alarmed at the constant use of explosive devices and car bombs by ISIS, with subsequent results of civilian victims, together with the practice of the same terrorist organization of abducting individuals and carrying out summary executions as part of the ample record of human rights violations and violations of international law. We also reject the deliberate attacks of a terrorist group on schools on Syria and Aleppo, which are violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. These are illegal actions which set the scene for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Those responsible must be brought to justice. In this context, it is extremely striking that there are no direct references in the report to military operations in which the al-Nusra Front took part during the reporting period, although there are several references to ISIS and the non-state actors, which, by the way, is a misnomer. This lack of clarity and information, unfortunately, does not help to reach a full understanding of what is happening on the ground. We also reject the fact that militias associated to the Army of Conquest, like Jaish al-Islam, are using civilians of ethnic groups, minorities rather, as human shields. These actions must be emphatically rejected by the international community. This is an attempt on human dignity. We hope that organizations such as this will be added to the Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee list and associated bodies. It is high time that their actions are no longer sheltered under the umbrella of so-called non-state actors. We continue to condemn the practices of the so-called non-state actors and ISIS of using basic services such as as weapons of war. We also reject emphatically the continued destruction of the cultural heritage of Syria, which has been affected by the totalitarian vision of ISIS, which wants to eliminate any historical vestiges of the past which does not coincide with their visions of religion. We wish to raise our voice in defense of the children of Syria. We denounce terrorist attacks on children, and we call on the international community to mobilize in their defense. In the search for a negotiated political solution to the conflict, we welcome the fact that the participation of the Syrian government is taken into account in the Vienna consultations. The Syrian government is a prime actor in the search for an agreement. Pretending that the contrary is the case and stressing this fact makes no sense. It simply condemns the Syrian people to greater suffering and all of humanity to a labyrinth of uncertainty. It will only postpone the solution and strengthen terrorism. We reiterate our support to the work of the Special Envoy for Syria, Mr. Stefan de Mistura, who has our full support towards reaching a peaceful political solution to this conflict, with the full participation of all parties involved in the conflict and the government of President Bashar al-Assad. We are closely following the results of negotiations in Vienna and the implementation of an immediate ceasefire, which will help to palliate the humanitarian situation. Venezuela hopes to have access to all agreements and commitments made by the parties in Vienna as a member of the Security Council in order to contribute with the necessary unanimity in the work of this Council. We call for a negotiated solution to this crisis. The people of Syria has paid an extremely heavy price to defend its integrity, sovereignty, and to defeat terrorism. The international community must mobilize to put an end to violence and to restore peace. Syria, unfortunately, has become a laboratory of horror and death. History will judge those guilty for this atrocity. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Of Venezuela for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this important meeting and for presiding over it. Like earlier speakers before me, I wish to convey our deepest condolences to the delegations and people of France on the appalling and repulsive terrorist attacks in Paris last Friday. We stand in solidarity with France in this time of grief. In the same sentiment, our condolences are also extended to Lebanon, Tunisia, and Egypt. Madam President, I thank Mr. O'Brien, Madam Bangura, and Madam ZERROUGUI for their respective contributions to this meeting, all of which have underscored the desperate situations and the need for urgent action in Syria. Alongside other Council members, Malaysia too followed the outcome of the most recent talks in Vienna, and we note the announced roadmap towards a peaceful settlement to the conflict in Syria. My delegation stands ready to engage and looks forward to substantive deliberations by the Council on this matter. Madam President, inasmuch as political will played a large part in securing agreement in Vienna, we remain deeply concerned by the astounding toll of the Syrian conflict to date. More than 250,000 people dead, over 1 million people injured, over 7.6 million people displaced, roughly 13.5 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, including more than 5.6 million children. Average life expectancy shortened by almost 13 years, school attendance at less than 50%, and 3 out of 4 Syrians now live in poverty. Parties to the conflict remain indifferent to the pain and suffering inflicted upon the Syrian people. Acts of impunity continue unabated. We remind all parties to the conflict of the obligations to adhere to and respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The Syrian conflict also continues to be characterized by indiscriminate attacks and deliberate targetings of civilians and civilian infrastructure. The use of barrel bombs and toxic chemicals by the parties to the conflict are particularly abhorrent. Madam President, Malaysia remains deeply concerned by continued reports of sexual violence against women, girls, and children committed by parties to the conflict. Women and girls not only face rape and sexual abuse, they are also sold as sex slaves and forced into marriage to foreign fighters. It is disgraceful that children are stripped of their innocence and deprived of protections. The recruitment and use of children is becoming increasingly commonplace. Reports that children are being used as forced labor, as sex slaves, and even as human shields are deeply disturbing. The siege and starve mentality or strategy aimed at ensuring submission and surrender of whole population is a further disconcerting dimension to the Syrian conflict. It is appalling that in the 21st century that such a method has been employed as a strategy of war by the parties to the conflict. The fact that even schools and hospitals have been deliberately targeted is a reflection of the absolute disrespect, disregard, and contempt that the parties to the conflict have for the values of humanity. Madam President, in the face of such misery and desperations, we are heartened by the steadfast commitment by the various UN agencies and partners in providing much-needed humanitarian aid and support to the civilian population in Syria, and we commend their efforts. In this regard, we deeply regret that cross-line access continues to face security and administrative obstacles. We are further concerned that access to the populations in the hard-to-reach and besieged areas remain critical. The Syrian government must do more to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Madam President, on our part, my government is currently taking steps to honor its commitment to take in 3,000 Syrian refugees. We call on the international community to do as much as possible to help the Syrian people in their time of need. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malaysia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam President. We welcome you to the Security Council, and we thank you for convening today's meeting. We also want to thank USG O'Brien, SRSG ZERROUGUI, and SRSG Bangura for their soul-stirring briefings. We express our appreciation to the Secretary General for his latest monthly report on the subject. We also want to join other delegations in expressing our very deep condolences to the people of France and Lebanon on the horrific, despicable attacks on their population by ISIS. The briefings that we've had today and the report of the Secretary General clearly indicate that the humanitarian situation in Syria remains dire. The conflict continues to take a heavy toll on the civilian population. Non-combatants, especially women and children, face grave hardship with hundreds of thousands trapped in besieged areas. It is deeply troubling that international humanitarian law continues to be violated with impunity by the parties to the conflict. Over the past month, hundreds of civilians have been killed or injured or maimed in direct or indiscriminate attacks in populated areas. The warring parties must refrain from actions that jeopardize the safety and security of civilians. We must emphasize that deliberate targeting of civilians constitutes a war crime, and those responsible for such acts are war criminals who must be brought to justice. We take positive note of the commitment by the government of Syria to refrain from the indiscriminate use of weapons. We condemn the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, which is causing cuts to electricity and water supplies. This is compounding the already difficult humanitarian situation in Syria. We also condemn attacks on healthcare facilities and medical personnel, as well as the denial of care to those in need. These are clear violations of international humanitarian law. It is regrettable that the delivery of humanitarian assistance remained extremely challenging due to active conflict, insecurity, and administrative bottlenecks. There is a need for humanitarian actors to be allowed to perform their duties without hindrance. The parties must facilitate rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access to affected people throughout the country. We want to pay tribute to the UN humanitarian agencies and their partners for their unrelenting efforts at reaching millions of people in need of aid, despite the challenges in the operating environment. We do recognize that the UN monitoring mechanism is fulfilling its mandate by ensuring the strictly humanitarian nature of United Nations humanitarian shipments. We commend the governments of Jordan and Turkey for their sustained cooperation with this mechanism. Madam President, as clearly indicated this afternoon by SRSG ZERROUGUI in her briefing, the plight of children affected by the Syrian conflict is deeply disturbing. The recruitment and use of children in combat has become commonplace in Syria. We are particularly concerned about the cases of abduction, killing, and maiming of children, as well as attacks on schools. We underscore the need for the international community to act in concert in order to shield Syrian children from the disastrous consequences of war. Sexual violence in the Syrian conflict is also a matter of great concern. As succinctly stated by SRSG Bangura, displaced women and girls are at risk of various forms of sexual exploitation, including sexual enslavement, mass rape, and forced killings, and forced marriage. We condemn these heinous acts in the strongest terms. This state of affairs underscores the urgent need for more to be done to protect women and girls, and Ms. Bangura's 7-point strategy of what can be done is worth exploring. Madam President, we must all admit that the cause and effect relationship between the humanitarian situation and the conflict in Syria is what we must explore further. The sustainable solution to the humanitarian crisis in Syria lies in ending the conflict, and the path to ending the conflict is in dialogue and negotiation. After 5 years of fighting, it should be clear to the parties that there can be no military solution. We encourage the warring parties to sheath their swords, lay down their arms, and pursue a negotiated solution. The recent meetings in Vienna involving an expanded group of international stakeholders have provided the much-needed impetus to the search for peace in Syria. We believe that the sustenance of this initiative will provide an opportunity to develop a framework for peace along the key principles of the Geneva Communique. We support without reservation these efforts, and we hope that they will lead to lasting peace, restoration, and stability in Syria. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Nigeria for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Chad.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, pour la direction de cette séance.
Before we start, allow me to associate my voice with that of previous speakers, to pay tribute to the French government and people for their steadfastness in light of this barbaric act of terrorism which struck them. We condemn this horrendous act. We'd also like to extend our condolences to Lebanon and the Lebanese people who also fell victim to terrorism. I'd like to convey my gratitude to Mr. Stephen O'Brien, to Ms. Zainab Bangura, and of course Ms. LEILA ZERROUGUI for their briefings. For close to 5 years now, violent fighting on an almost daily basis has marked the lives of the Syrian people. The horrendous statistics of internally displaced people, of refugees, of the injured, of the destruction, every day further plunge Syrians into a situation of despair. The humanitarian situation in the country continues to deteriorate. This, despite the huge efforts undertaken by United Nations staff members, and we'd like to here pay tribute to their courage and their commitment. We condemn all attacks committed against innocent civilians, as well as the basic vital infrastructure of the country, and ask all parties to immediately lift all obstacles to the access of humanitarian aid for civilians in combat areas, including in besieged zones. We'd like to reiterate our call upon all the parties to the conflict to put an end to the violence and wish to underscore their obligation to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law, as well as all the relevant provisions of Security Council Resolution 2139. There is a need here to recall that the systematic refusal to provide humanitarian access to the civilian population, depriving them from the basic necessities they require for their survival, such as water and medicine, of course, are a serious violation of human dignity and the most basic principles of international humanitarian law. Madam President, Security Council meetings on Syria succeed one another without any improvement in the situation experienced by the long-suffering Syrian people. It's high time for the Security Council to consider firmer, stronger, more robust, concrete measures to put an end to this human tragedy which is being experienced by Syria. This unending war, with unspeakable consequences, leads to a complete rejection of international humanitarian laws and has reduced the Security Council to the role of a powerless observer. We urge the donor community to respond to the various calls and appeals for humanitarian financing which would enable the United Nations staff members and their partners to provide the necessary assistance to the civilian population in need, both within as well as outside Syria. The coming winter will expose the civilian population to very difficult living conditions. And for this reason, we require special mobilization by the whole of the international community. As we've always said, humanitarian action, despite its scale, will never be able to substitute itself for a political process. And this is the reason why we have to step up our efforts aimed at helping the parties to find a negotiated solution to the conflict, a solution which is able to put an end to the suffering of the Syrian people and launch an inclusive political transition. It behooves states possessing any influence with the various parties to spare no effort, to prompt them to commit themselves in good faith to direct negotiations to implement the Geneva Communique. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Chad for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Saludamos su presencia de la Secretaria de Estado para
el welcome you, Secretary of State for International Development of the United Kingdom, Justin Greening. We are also grateful for the presentations of the Deputy Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Stephen O'Brien, the special representatives of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict, Ms. Zainab Hawa Bangura, and the issue of children in armed conflicts, LEILA ZERROUGUI. We extend our condolences and solidarity to the victims, the families of the victims, the people in the government of France, and the people in the government of Lebanon. And we extend our condolences to all countries and regions who daily suffer from the scourge of terrorism. Any act of terrorism is criminal, unjustifiable, and the material authors, organizers, and backers must be brought to justice. Madam President, the latest report of the Secretary General is one of the many warnings that the situation in Syria has become unsustainable. The conflict breaks down the basic conditions for a society, Syrian society's identity, security and dignity. It is impossible to remain indifferent faced with the enormous vulnerability and the effects of this crisis on the civilian population, which cannot access indispensable basic elements for its daily life. All parties are aware of the grave consequences of these acts, which cannot take shelter in impunity. Those responsible must be brought to justice. We reiterate the need to promote mechanisms protecting the civilian population, such as the reopening of humanitarian corridors, which will facilitate care for the population in displaced people's camps, and especially in areas which are difficult to gain access to. It is imperative to generate conditions to ensure respect for international humanitarian law and effectively implement humanitarian resolutions calling on the parties to refrain from continue attacking medical facilities, schools, and basic infrastructure. Madam President, the presentation we have just heard from Special Representative Bangura simply confirms the gravity of the situation of sexual violence and gender violence in the Syrian conflict. where it is being used not only as a tactic of war, but also a tactic of terror. It is essential for the United Nations system to recommend and implement measures based on the situation noted on the ground. We must fully implement Resolution 2016 and zero tolerance for sexual violence. We are also concerned at the devastating consequences of constant attacks on boys and girls and limited access to education, amongst other fundamental rights. We cannot allow a generation to be lost, and we are responsible as a Security Council when it comes to this tragedy, as Ms. ZERROUGUI pointed out. It is fundamental to implement the Oslo Declaration on Safe Schools and the Lucens Guidelines, as well as Resolution 2143 of this very Council, to protect schools from military use during armed conflicts. Lastly, Madam President, we wish to conclude by reiterating that the political situation is the only path to respond to humanitarian needs. Recent talks in Vienna are a glimmer of hope, and we call for implementation of the clauses of the Vienna Communique of October 30 and the elements agreed upon by the International Syria Support Group. It is also essential to have a political process led by Syrians themselves, as enshrined in the Geneva Communique. However, the political solution will continue to be far away as long as the conflict is militarized. We categorically call for an end for the supply and flow of weapons to all parties. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Chile for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
permettez-moi d'abord de remercier
allow me
l'ensemble
to
des
start by thanking all of the speakers for their briefings. Mr. O'Brien, Ms. ZERROUGUI, and Ms. Bangura. They remind us through their untiring work how many civilians, how many women, how many children suffer directly in Syria. I would also like to thank in a very heartfelt way all those who extended to my country their sympathy as well as their solidarity after the horrible attacks committed on November 13th. On that day, France was struck at her very heart, in Paris and in Saint-Denis, by terrorist attacks which were masterminded and planned in Syria. The record, as you know, is a very heavy one. At least 129 dead, over 300 injured, and a great many individuals who right now here, as we speak, still hang on between life and death. France received a great many gestures of solidarity and friendship from throughout the world. These gestures, these messages touch us and illustrate the unanimous support which the international community has lent my country. France, of course, was not the only country which was attacked Friday evening. At least 19 different nationalities were affected. Our thoughts go to the families of the victims, both in France and throughout the world, but our thoughts also go to all of the families which were affected these last few months by terrorism which acknowledges no color nor religion. Lebanon, Turkey, Denmark, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt, and other countries yet. Madam President, I am the representative of a country which is still standing, which is united, more determined than ever before in the past, who speaks to you. We are committed to combating terrorism with respect for the laws and the rule of law. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, the motto of the French Republic, never meant more. France is a free and independent country, pluralistic, strong in terms of its multiculturality. This is the France which was hit on Friday, November 13th. The enemy is well known, Daesh. This monster feeds on ethnic and religious division in the region and was beefed up by hatred and the rejection of the other. It oppresses and massacres people in the Middle East on a daily basis and is methodically destroying its unique cultural wealth, which of course belongs to the common heritage of mankind. Faced with this, we need to be guided by two objectives, and they complement each other. On the one hand, we have a resolute, determined, there's a need for a resolute, determined fight against terrorism and Daesh. The whole of the international community can be united in this fight. The President of the Republic indicated this morning that France will seize the Security Council to have the Council adopt a resolution aimed at fighting against terrorism. President Hollande has also called for togetherness within the framework of a great and united international coalition to combine our strength and our means to destroy Daesh. Daesh is our common enemy, and we must put an end to those who destroy and kill with such determination. Finally, the search for a political solution in Syria, more necessary than ever before. Syria has become the greatest factory, manufacturing terrorists. The members of the Council and the countries in the region must unite to relaunch a political transition, one in which Bashar al-Assad is not part of the solution. There is a need to achieve concrete progress in the field of humanitarian issues, as well as the cessation of all indiscriminate attacks against civilians. In Vienna, France made a number of concrete proposals on this to mitigate the suffering of the civilian population at a time when the situation on the ground, which is already alarming, is further deteriorating. The resolutions adopted by this Council must be implemented without delay. This is something which was recalled here. It is crucial that we should stand united in the face of these two objectives. The refugee crisis is one of the most direct consequences of this humanitarian disaster. If it lasts, this situation cannot but create a highly destabilizing situation. It is more important than ever before to help the countries bordering on Syria. They, after all, host the greatest number of Syrian refugees, and I wish to thank them here for this. Right after the countries of the region, Europe is at the front line. The inhabitants of Iraq and Syria, including in territories controlled by Daesh, are fleeing because of being oppressed. Welcoming them in a dignified way is a moral obligation for Europe, with respect for fundamental freedoms and the rule of law on which it has been forged. Despite these tragic events and these attempts at destabilization, France will never renounce what she is, a free country, and she will never renounce her values. We will overcome this trial, but we, the international community, must stand united and together defend these universal principles. The determination of France is absolute. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
يذكرني تعامل البعض في مجلس الأمن مع الوضع في سوريا بلادي
address the situation in Syria reminds me of a quote by Shakespeare.
There is an elephant in the room.
There is an elephant in the room.
أي بالعربي هناك فيل في الغرفة. وهذه العبارة تعني أن هناك مشكلة
means that there is a huge, visible problem that cannot be overlooked. However, certain members in this chamber pretend that it doesn't exist. and they choose not to address it or seek a solution to it. This is precisely how certain Security Council members addressed the situation in Syria, when their decision-makers ignored the key scourge destabilizing Syria, the region, and the whole world. The scourge which was the main reason for the humanitarian tragedy besetting several areas in Syria, which was the main reason for the suffering of children and women in Syria, and in transforming segments of the Syrian people to IDPs and refugees. This scourge is the transboundary Takfiri terrorism funded by well-known states, chief among them Saudi Arabia, which is the bloodline that provides the elixir of life to terrorism. The scourge of terrorism was unleashed from the Wahhabi nest. It struck in a barbaric and indiscriminate manner Damascus, Baghdad, Beirut, Kuwait, Sinai, Abuja, Mali, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, Sydney, Boston, Paris, and other states and other cities. Condemning in the strongest terms the terrorist acts that beset Paris and expressing our condolences to the families of the victims. We recall that in this very chamber there are members who prevented the Security Council 9 times from issuing a mere press statement condemning similar attacks that targeted innocent civilians in Damascus, Aleppo, and other Syrian cities. Logically, what we have witnessed in these cities did not come from a vacuum, and it has not happened. It did not happen by chance. It is the certain outcome of the attempt of certain parties to ignore this issue and failure to address it with the serious and attention that is required. So long as it strikes the others. This is a certain outcome of the exploitation by certain parties to blackmail the Syrian government. We have warned since the outset that those who exploit terrorism, justify it, or fall silent at it will be burnt by terrorism, because it is a dynamic, transboundary phenomenon. However, our calls fell on deaf ears. Rather, certain states managed to make terrorism enter the political arena from the main door. They resorted to word games, dividing terrorism into 2 categories, permissible and prohibited, calling certain terrorists moderate opposition, disregarding the consequences of such a course, and not realizing that if you have a political problem with the Syrian government, this is a negotiable issue. But if you resort to sanctions, and if you fund terrorism, and if you refuse to coordinate with the Syrian government and army in order to combat this transboundary crime, this is a crime that you commit against your own people. As much as it is a crime against the Syrian people, because as you know, we are in Syria, we are fighting on behalf of the whole world, filthy terrorist groups. Every time the Syrian army kills a foreign terrorist, dozens of innocent potential victims are protected. When this terrorists will go back home and do the same thing. Those who distort this reality is an accomplice in the flail of terrorism. he or she is a partner in the bloodshed of victims. We recall that perpetrators of many terrorist attacks in several cities in the world, including the recent bloody attacks against Paris, were among the thousands of Europeans whose entry to Syria was facilitated as jihadists after receiving brainwash by fatwas funded by Gulf states, well-known Gulf states. There is a late awakening on the seriousness of terrorism that led the president of a permanent Security Council member to amend the constitution of his country to face up to the Takfiri terrorism. Hence, acts should accompany words with regard to combating terrorism in Syria that is funded by 40 states, in addition to the illegal trade of oil and illegal trade of artifacts in Syria through our borders with Turkey. This requires serious political will to implement relevant Security Council resolution on combating terrorism, chief among them 2070, 2178, 2199, which were asserted by the Second Vienna Communique. This requires also concerted, coordinated, collective efforts under one front against terrorism, away from the political opportunists or amateurs. Time and again, we have expressed our readiness to cooperate with any state that is serious in combating terrorism. This is precisely what has happened through the joint Syrian-Russian military action in combating terrorism, in addition to the intelligence coordination between Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Russia, which led to practical results in the field, namely the retreat by terrorist groups in many areas, which led to the secure, safe, voluntary return of 1 million Syrian IDPs to their homes. Addressing terrorism, sir, leads me to address the political solution of the crisis in Syria. Combating terrorism seriously and effectively will contribute to the success of this solution. From the outset, the Syrian government expressed its readiness to contribute to any serious efforts in order to achieve the political solution. This is why we cooperated with Mr. Kofi Annan, accepting his 6-point plan. We then cooperated with Mr. Lakhdar Brahimi, and we contributed to the Geneva II conference. We also cooperated with Mr. de Mistura and accepted his proposal on Aleppo, and accepted to take part in the 4 working groups suggested by him. Our political message to you, ladies and gentlemen, following the end of the Vienna meeting, is that the Syrian government stands ready to contribute to any sincere effort in order to achieve a political solution where Syrians decide their own future and their choices through dialogue among Syrians under a Syrian leadership without external intervention, in a manner that secures the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria. This what has been asserted by the several resolutions adopted by this Council, in addition to the 2 Vienna communiques. Unfortunately, the recent report by the Secretary General on the implementation of resolutions 2139, 2165, 2191, was politicized, biased, including many erroneous pieces of information and lacuna. We have addressed 2 identical letters to the President of the Security Council and the Secretary General on this issue. I wish to address a serious matter in this report, namely, the report is based on unreliable sources from sources whose connections are very well known, which mislead the councils of the members of the council. With regard to the allegation that the Syrian government is using indiscriminate weapons, I assert that the Syrian army does not, has not, will not use any indiscriminate weapons. It acts in accordance with international law in the framework of combating terrorism. Those who are killing civilians are those who are using them as human shields in many areas in Syria. In closing, our deliberations and ongoing assertions on the dangers of terrorism and the importance of its combating should not be misunderstood, that we do not realize the seriousness of the humanitarian situation in Syria, the situation of our children and our women. But this should not be at the expense on the crux of the problem, and should not be politicized or should not be subjected to double standards. We are in discussion with Mr. O'Brien, Mrs. ZERROUGUI, and Mrs. Bangura. We have organized field missions to Syria in order to address any outstanding issues. I welcome Mr. O'Brien's visit next month to Syria. We stand ready to cooperate with good-intentioned Security Council members in order to improve the situation in Syria. I thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Attorney General Loretta Lynch testifies at a Justice Department oversight hearing. She's expected to get questions about last Friday's terrorist attacks in Paris and Syrian refugees being allowed in the U.S. We have live coverage from the House Judiciary Committee tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3. Later in the day, a Senate panel looks at the relationship between the federal government and state and local law enforcement.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.